Thank you for coming to listening at this stage of the conference. You must be dead tired. It's been really fun here. So, aesthetics as a companion discipline. In 1872, Friedrich Nietzsche held a series of fiery lectures at the Basel City Museum with the title Zukunft unserer Bildungsanstalten, in English known through the relatively late translation from 2015, Anti-Education, or the future of our educational institutions, where the thinker dived into what he saw as the problems of the university system, so foreshadowing already his academic exile, which was soon also to become his trademark, in the footsteps of his hero, Arthur Schopenhauer, the first open enemy of academic philosophy, both, to quote R.J. Collingdale, so becoming glamorous outsiders as freelancers. Nietzsche's anger and frustration had to do with very different problems than Schopenhauer's, whose rage towards universities, which he expressed especially in the essay on university philosophy, 1851, of Verhältnis zu Universitätsphilosophie, was mainly based on being critical against the religious and state-driven conformism, which he thought held scholars captive, and the heavy formalism of the era, which, for example, the, at the time, fresh and trendy footnote system represented, with its performativity, which was far more extensive than it is in our days. Many scholars writing more than a half of the page only footnotes, showing off their broad knowledge and even contact networks in them. Nietzsche's affects might, of course, have grown gigantic due to the relocation from intellectually active Leipzig, where he had friends of the stature of Richard Wagner and Cosima Wagner. He had also witnessed Goethe's wit, and had to now move to the smaller, very much more petit bourgeois Basel, where he received a tenure at the age of only 24, without even a finished doctoral dissertation, due to the recommendation of his professor, Friedrich Ritschl, and where he had to also teach in the gymnasium, while the free Humboldtian university system was soon also elsewhere, as the times were changing, overshadowed by a more modern, discipline-driven university system. Like in Schopenhauer's case, Nietzsche reacted also towards the nationalization of education. But like Giorgio Colli notes in his introduction to the Italian edition, Sull'avvenire della nostra scuola, 1975, Nietzsche was not the only one reacting to something that felt for many like an industrialization of knowledge production and teaching. Nietzsche's defense of free minds, of course partly disturbingly genius-driven, in Nietzsche's case, though less misogynic than the usual genius discourse, which Christine Battersby has thoroughly analyzed in her seminal work, Gender and Genius. Following Nietzsche's admiration of Cosima, found one problem in the rise of stronger boundaries between disciplines. It was not that the philosopher would have stood against focus or strong disciplinary methodology, but that he felt that disciplinarization stood on the way for those who desired to find their path freely. He had, of course, himself bridged linguistics to philosophy in his attempt to demolish metaphysics, thinking that language was a big chunk of the problem. Hard to say what Nietzsche would have said, but for a reader today like me, it looks like he actually turned linguistics and a thorough understanding of classics, which he also defended in Anti-Education, as they were increasingly less appreciated, to be helpful companions of philosophy on its way to what he considered to be the quest for truth. For sure, the story is about the way the pre-disciplinary era was coming to its end. And it ended in the 17th century in some sense, but brought also more into it distinct specialist and professional, also professionalist academic fields, which started to become institutionally polished during the mid to late 19th century. Schopenhauer's, but even more Nietzsche's era was one where the times really were changing, and a moment we seldom think about, not very far away from our own, where the scholarly identities are so strong that it makes sense now to talk about interdisciplinary research. While disciplines such as sociology, psychology, and anthropology emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as researchers applied more systematic methods of the natural sciences to human sciences and the mind. If one had lived and worked a life in a good university with a lot of great minds without strict borders, the change itself could have been enough to raise counter reactions. Not forgetting that the Humboldtian University, which had revolutionized modern academia, and which had aimed to teach students how to learn and teach themselves. This is what the German university system at the time was famous for, and this was the reason for students coming from other countries. And where academic freedom combined with an aim to educate well-rounded critical thinkers, straightly speaking, general education, with an aim to educate well-rounded critical thinkers only, was losing to a more nationalist university model, where the production of diplomas was suddenly more important than before. Well, all this, in times of crisis of universities, which for sure many of us now think we are again going through in another way, this is just one interesting story in the history of the university system. But our own disciplinary situation has lately changed quite a lot, so much that the situation might push for new ways of thinking about disciplinarity. Since the 70s onwards, academia has seen the establishment of many famous hubs for people with varied backgrounds, like the Domus of Bologna, which since 1971 was not just a space for scholarship in the humanities, starring Umberto Eco, but became a famous vital cultural space. Or the MIT Media Lab, which since 1985 started bringing together researchers from far-ranging fields. And I myself have worked already for years without a disciplinary status in a variety of programs with changing names, where I have from time to time felt like a theory plumber whose role has been to advise what to read or how to find relevant research about something at stake in various situations in a multi-artistic environment. Not seldom have I encountered scholars in culture studies who have underlined their confidence in non-disciplinarity, as they call it, where one studies what is needed for one's research. But interestingly, in many of those communities which I worked in or with, it was in the end hard to find anyone who I thought was able to go deep with anything. And I suppose we have all seen the way philosophers who produce more questions than answers can in the end get packaged to be simplified tools in this kind of contexts, which is, by the way, something I have nothing against, as it can for sure also be productive. It is noteworthy that modern aesthetics really has a clear start, which even precedes the high era of discipline production, with Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten discussing it in his Reflections on Poetry in 1735, where he came up with the idea of aesthetics, which could improve the lower faculties of knowing and apply them more happily for the benefit of the whole world. Then expanded and treated in a more disciplinary manner in Aesthetica in 1758, which we know did not start aesthetic theory, which had roamed since Bharatas and Abhinavagupta's, Plato's, Diotimas and Aristotle's times. In Aesthetica, Baumgarten felt that he had to complement his teacher's Christian Wolff's logics, where clear and distinct abstract concepts failed, according to Baumgarten, to account for the rich, concrete, and individual details of the material world. Aesthetics stood for a parallel logic of the lower cognitive faculties and allowed for the knowledge of sensible perfection or beauty as a supplement, plainly speaking. While the concept had been used already in Greek times, standing for the ability to receive stimulation from the senses, it was now named the science of aesthetics, for the study of taste, artistic beauty, and natural beauty. I'm sure we know this story, many of us. Abbé Bateau's Le Beaux réduit à un même principe was still fresh from 1746. In English, the fine arts reduced to a single principle, a work that Paul Oscar Christeler coined as having taken the decisive step towards the system of the fine arts, producing the first to set forth a clear-cut system of the fine arts in a treatise devoted entirely to this subject. It was a strong start, and reading and writing about aesthetic matters quickly became an intellectual fashion, as Göran Sjörbom notes. And also here in Finland, local notes seemed to be a bit of a subtext of the conference. Sweden at the time, chairs of and duties to teach aesthetics were established, beginning from Uppsala in 1785 and ending up on the Finnish side, Turku, Åbo, in 1795. And as Sweden was quite an empire at the time, it established chairs also in Copenhagen, Denmark, and Greifswald, Germany, before the turn of the century. First, often with the title History and Theory of Letters, which here in Finland also took the name of aesthetics combined with literature in 1852, dropping literature out rather late in the 90s. The same kind of development happened in various countries and areas of Europe. And scholars like, for example, Slavka Kopachkova have studied well the missionary energy which distributed aesthetics around the Visegrad countries. Still today, the institutional position of aesthetics is, I would say, quite unique. Aesthetics might, of course, refer to many different practices and traditions again. Aesthetics, sometimes more narrowly called philosophy of art, is a branch of philosophy, one of the 5 main branches of philosophy, as some say. But while it is not commonplace to provide institutional autonomy for epistemology or logics, one can study aesthetics as its own discipline in many universities. Besides this, major names in the field often work in art and design universities. Figures like Eko, Jyrko Saito, Peter Sloterdijk, Boris Groys, and Ossi Naukkarinen have this sort of careers, where the students/followers consist or have consisted mainly of broadly speaking artists who engage with aesthetics, sometimes to the extent that their main career in the end lands in aesthetic research more than art. In conferences, a major part of the scholars attending often come from departments with a non-philosophical orientation, like literature studies, art history, musicology, or more broadly just art research, if not art education, or sometimes cultural studies. In the BA and MA programs dedicated to aesthetics in Europe, the curriculum is, on the other hand, nearly if not always, quite interdisciplinary. The teaching consisting of philosophical aesthetics, sharing the nest with, for example, semiotics, art theory, or the study of culture/cultural studies, without forgetting the variety of philosophical schools out there, often not very easy to pull into the same discourse. We often try. Speaking about templates of writing and argumentation, which in today's philosophy of science sounds more lucrative to me than methodology as an explaining concept, although I suppose it's more used about simpler modeling techniques, aesthetics embraces such a broad variety of approaches, from Italian hermeneutics to analytic aesthetics, from Indian aesthetics to French phenomenology, that it is a sheer impossibility to be connoisseur of all schools. We are not only talking about methodological differences or paradigms, but even ways of writing that make crossover sometimes harder to do inside of aesthetics than when turning the gaze outwards. Aesthetics could easily be seen multidisciplinary itself. And this is something that can be witnessed when a Heideggerian and an analytic philosopher discuss. Aestheticians are also usually well aware of at least the existence of even the most distant ways of working in the field, often sociological, anthropological, and semiotic too. And they are often, this is what most people in the field say, considered to be quite tolerant to other ways of working than their own. While the base for the game has been created and distributed in and from the European continent, today dominantly from Anglo-Saxon countries, still Western estheticians know better Asian counterparts than people in most other disciplines. And the conferences are not just about applying Western aesthetics all around the world, but also methodological dialogue with, for example, Japanese aesthetics or Indian. This makes aesthetics quite special. Classics, conferences, journals, chairs and institutes dedicated to or open for aesthetics have a big role in the institutionalization and identity of aesthetics. Then they have, for example, in sociology, where departments can be big and the identity and foundation is strictly for sociology only, and the institutional base is already provided by the university in another way. In aesthetics, it really might make sense to say that anyone who participates in a conference, or as it was paraphrased on the conference dinner, is an esthetician, thinking about Ossis and Pauline's remarks yesterday. At the same time, this is noteworthy, I think. We have left art, the original motor behind the first major theories of modern aesthetics, behind us, not totally, but as a regulative foundation, to become more of a historical, only partly regulative horizon. We have not dropped our interest for it, but it does not restrict studies in aesthetics. Like Yuriko Saito said in her keynote speech for EVA in Warsaw, November 2025, it has even become a sort of a playful game where some of us try to find new topics where aesthetics can or could be applied. But as she said, this too starts to feel a bit like a past stage already. Taking these facts into consideration, the hybrid situation of mainly being a margin of some bigger and better institutionally established discipline, philosophy can be counted in as another one here too, as Joseph Tanke has neatly pointed out, but still having its own very strong path, but always in dialogue with developments in arts and culture. The lack of discourse on the way aesthetics thrives in and with other disciplines, and how other disciplines view and use aesthetics, looks awkward to me. It's not just that aesthetics, mostly pragmatist, jumps in as a deus ex machina when debates turn theoretical in, for example, American art education. There was a critical discussion between Kevin Tabin and Paul Duncombe on this matter, where the usefulness of aesthetics, always just stepping in and fixing the problem, was denied and criticized. And that continental aesthetics, mainly French these days, is taken into use when people get stuck in art universities. Beyond traditions like sociological aesthetics or semiotics of art, where knowledge of the work done in philosophical aesthetics is typical, if not even a must, aesthetic theory lands in a variety of ways and disciplines, as different as computer science, martial arts studies, and engineering, where scholars are actually often happy to have a chat with a real aesthetician, but where we don't often enter, and where non-aestheticians often solve issues their own way, creating conventions and traditions on their own, which we for sure could have comments to share about, better concepts to suggest for use, or already existing debates to recommend for reading. Thinking about the increasingly hard competition for funding and the way aesthetics schizophrenically is sometimes mentioned as a discipline of the future. This is what the Finnish Ministry of Education just wrote last year in its report on education. While aestheticians face increasing difficulties to survive in the academia, could have focused on aesthetics as a companion discipline, which they haven't much work to ameliorate nor develop, although the seeds were out there right from the beginning. Be a useful way of continuing from where the disappearance of art as our fundament has left us, where we have already showed with applied and everyday aesthetics that anything can be studied. Could it prove a good strategy for survival? For sure, we are needed outside of our own journals and conferences. Could we, focusing on that, increase our funding opportunities? And for sure, many of you already are somewhere else, game studies, art education, but there might still be a bit more loose money, and you might think of your unit as a place for fostering aesthetics as a sort of a side dish. Or sneakily, it's central. Infrastructure questions aside, while we have lately increasingly taken a look at, for example, brain research, and for sure, philosophers have always had a word to say in film studies, could there be discussions/debates out there where we could, more than now, give a helping hand? Or where we could even learn something new through dialogue? Who knows, maybe even something that could change some of our own axioms. We have lately learned a lot about history. In Aesthetic Science, published in 2020, Alexander Bragg-Morley shows how the pioneering work of the natural scientists of the 17th century Royal Society of London was not just actively visualized, but based essentially on aesthetic principles and ideals. Being one of many who viewed the universe as a piece of design by God, Robert Boyle thought that the experience of mechanical causation in the products of art could furnish the mind with the means to explain how natural things accomplished apparently similar forms of purposiveness, and accentuated the role of bodily organs of sensation for obtaining knowledge about the causes and purposes of natural phenomena. Many natural scientists of the time, for example, Edward Leavitt, merged also with the at the time growing discussion on ruins and interpreted mountains and natural phenomena as objects where traces of history could be seen in the ancient design of God. And one key topic of discussion was Stonehenge. The interest in snowflakes produced artistic, speculative visual material, ink drawings, by Robert Hooke, who also considered them to be ruins of once perfect ice crystals. And the images done were speculations made for understanding more and fostering research perspectives, not at least only for graphic motivations done. He studied the patterns and made his point partly by drawing. Aesthetics and artistry fueled the intellectual and methodological expeditions into the fundament of science. Nature was the design of God, a rotten tree was a ruin. Sensory experience, as Bragg-Morley writes in his historical study, should serve as the foundation for a new science of nature, they thought. The famous drawings of, for example, text seem to have become something we need to reinterpret. Aesthetics was not the core of the practice, but a companion, and a true companion, not just helping pedagogically through art. Madalina Diacono has lately written about the role of aesthetics in meteorology. I'm quoting, "The systematic examination of the aesthetic experience of the weather condition starts by acknowledging the enjoyment of perceptual qualities related to the diversity of hues, textures, and randomly distributed visual patterns in the sky. Non-visual impressions are auditory, tactile, and thermic, olfactory, as well as physiological reactions to electricity and magnetism," she writes and continues, I'm quoting again. "Related to emotions is the use of aesthetic qualifications in meteorological discourses." End of quote. While the aesthetic framing is less present, maybe, in today's professional work, although characterizations of weather events as beautiful, splendid, awesome, or marvelous are detectable in meteorological treatises, Diacono writes and continues, and express their authors' implicit aesthetic preferences, which commonly reflect collective stereotypes, such as the appraisal of blue, cloudless sky and of vividly colored sunsets. End of quote. The history of meteorology shows the presence of aesthetics in various ways. Diacono continues, I'm quoting again. For example, John Tyndall, the discoverer of the greenhouse effect, published 2 books about his expeditions in the Alps in the 1860s, in which he combined adventurous leisure with scientific research. One of these is strictly divided between a chiefly narrative and a chiefly scientific part to meet the distinct categories of readers' expectations. Even so, the narrative half of his travelogue mixes literary depictions of landscapes and weather events, references to romantic poetry and drawings with accounts of experiments, scientific observations, diagrams, and charts. End of quote. Diacono continues writing about the language of meteorology, turning the aesthetician's gaze towards terms with an empirical base and expressions of the type splendid weather, which of course refers mainly to just the blue clear sky, and the whole cultural presentation model of weather forecasts with its symbols. I'm quoting again her excellent essay, Aesthetics and Meteorology. And finally, meteorologists occasionally analyzed modern works of art. For example, 2 different international research teams examined in 2006 and 2024 the scientific correctness of Van Gogh's representations of a world sky in The Starry Night, Road with Cypress and Star, and Wheatfield with Crows. Both times the scientists reached the conclusion that the painter could represent atmospheric turbulences in a precise manner, either because he had studied the cloud movements or due to an innate sense of atmospheric dynamics. A third hypothesis, Van Gogh's knowledge of scientific theories, had to be excluded, since his paintings anticipated with half a century the mathematician Andrei Kolmogorov's model of worlds from 1940s. The fact that this unusual research was not meant as an amusement is demonstrated by the publication of its results in specialized journals for natural sciences. End of quote. Here also, we should not forget that meteorologists have been interested in some of our most treasured objects, like Edvard Munch's Scream, which was painting in various ways and with different templates between 1893 and 1910. I'm quoting again. Its tormented red sky had for a long time been associated with Munch's mental disturbance, anxiety, and obsession with grief and death. However, given that his representation of the atmosphere displays similarities with Van Gogh, like swirls, it was analyzed with respect to its mathematical correctness along with Van Gogh's paintings, leading to the disappointing conclusion that the luminance probability distribution doesn't fit Kolmogorov's theory. Nevertheless, the Scream continues to fascinate meteorologists, and even stirred a controversy between 2 hypotheses. Either that Munch represented the volcanic sunset he must have seen after the Krakatau eruption in 1883, or that he witnessed stratospheric nacros, mother of pearl, clouds, which can be seen only seldom outside polar regions, but which Munch probably observed in Oslo. If the latter conjecture is correct, then the Scream represents one of the earliest visual documentations of an nacros cloud display. End of quote. The examples above in the latter meteorology accompany aesthetics, in some sense, and art history, and much as aesthetic thinking accompanies meteorology, give at least some kind of an idea of the role of aesthetics in other disciplines. Often scholars in these other disciplines were happy when an aesthetician walks in, as I learned again 2 years ago when I went to the World Summit of Martial Arts Studies, as I started to write a book on the aesthetics of martial arts, which could as well be called aesthetics in martial arts, as aesthetic issues are debated from 17th century ninja manuals to books on the use of the sword and archery so much that the historical survey of the already existing connections between aesthetic theory and martial arts studies grew surprisingly big. It seemed that nearly everyone understood in the conference that aesthetics was already there, here and there, in classics and in contemporary research. And I was astonished about the enthusiasm martial arts scholars showed when an aesthetician came to the event, where topics mainly varied from gender equality in Taekwondo in India to the use of martial arts in prison violence. A huge array of views lurks, though, in a discipline which has fought against aesthetics on a very symbolical level. We find sometimes today also currents against strict discipline-driven thinking and the idea that a discipline is in some sense, this may sound paradoxical, non-disciplinary. by its very essence, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, or transdisciplinary. I'm talking about cultural studies. For many of us, cultural studies often look like borrowing themes and concepts from a variety of disciplines, often really a lot from aesthetics. But in the end, it might look like a discipline using mainly social science type of basic argumentation to finish the point. Scholars writing with very different methodologies and logics, from Gilles Deleuze to Julia Kristeva, figures like Umberto Eco and Jean Mukashevsky become inserted into a sort of a tool pack. To some extent, for example, aesthetics, or the former or some other, mostly French aesthetics, works like an auxiliary companion in the efforts made to explain art, culture, and society without forgetting popular culture. Sometimes I'd say aesthetics actually does all the work, but gets just templated in a new way at the same time as the scholar in question does not think he, she, other is doing aesthetics in the end. We live also in a time where interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, and cross-disciplinarity are code words for funding. A new framing comes from what they call convergence, which is abandoned the idea of scientists working in parallel and sharing results for an adaptation of demanding deep foundational integration from the earlier stages of projects, so leading to more seamless co-production of new perspectives and concepts. In many cases, for example, in my own work environment, there is still something else that often catches the attention of someone educated in a discipline, c'est moi. And it could be called non-disciplinary research, which I think often comes close to investigative journalism, and forms often the written part of artistic research works, where people with no disciplinary base pick up in a grocery store and a karaoke fashion text to support their journey. And don't take me wrong again. Sometimes this, of course, probably only with the help of immense tacit knowledge from life work in arts, can produce interesting results too. Taking all of this into account, anyway, it keeps surprising me. I know I'm repeating myself, how much aesthetics is still discussed only as an autonomic territory and not a companion. When I think how my friends in philosophy of science work a couple of years with, for example, biologists and share their interesting remarks about the dialogues with them, like, think these top biologists don't talk about species but large populations sharing the same mutations, I feel an envy that our discipline, with all respect to the great classics from Kant to Hegel, or today from covering Korsmeyer's Adventures in Disgust to Elisa Di Stefano's studies of historical beautification manuals, has not yet worked out this sort of a dialogical stance. Ossi Naukkarinen writes in his Aesthetics and AI, in principle, I'm quoting Ossi, everything has its aesthetics, some kind of. Anything can be approached by paying attention to its aesthetic aspects. It's a different matter how fruitful that is, with all possible cases, but it can be done. Likewise, in principle, the academic discipline of aesthetics could be combined with any other discipline. Then concepts, theories, points of view, and practices of aesthetics would be made use of in the context of other disciplines. In practice, this is not the case, of course. Only some combinations are actively developed. End of quote. Ossi continues by writing that when combining takes place, or when we even ponder whether it should happen, there is no standard procedure for that. In standard use, combining means to bring into such close relationship as to obscure individual characters, which is more or less the same thing as to merge, fuse, coalesce, or unify. In this article, however, I use the term in a broader sense to cover more variations, some of which point toward rather different types of relations between two or more disciplines, not only toward complete merging. In some cases, it might be better to use the word collaborating or cooperating. Like Naukkarinen knows, the trend to talk about multi, inter, etc. disciplinary work refers at least partly to combining disciplines in various ways. I'm quoting again. One reason for combining disciplines is a belief that none of the two or more disciplines alone can address a certain important phenomenon in an effective and illuminative way. The hope is that the new Hmong rule will do it better. Because climate change, for example, is such a complicated phenomenon, it is reasonable to emphasize that various complementary approaches are needed to make sense of it. And different disciplines or parts of them are growing or have already grown together in many universities into climate studies or climate change research. End of quote. But then I have to part from Naukkarinen's text. He writes that a true merger resulting into something new can only happen if none of the parties dominate. And if any of them does, the strongest one may just integrate the weaker ones into itself. End of quote. Why? Naukkarinen talks about unnecessary integration, but why would it entail that? What's wrong with aesthetics and its small role in art education, for example? And it does not look like a dominant discipline would eat up all the less dominant disciplines. At least historically, it looks quite good. Could not also more conscious thinking about the role of a companion have a good effect here? Anyway, aesthetics could inform many discussions where it is not yet much present. I am in no need of Adrian Kwawachka's call, "Make aesthetics great again." Of course, an ironical expression, but also a reminder about the great role aesthetics still had in 19th century philosophy. But working in a very international, half of my students are from abroad, art and design school, I'm constantly bombarded by, for example, post-colonialist urges, desiring to expand the art system, which was created by the upper class, mainly male continental European at the verge of modernity, with all the bugs one can imagine with a background like that. And I try to jump in, always saying that the framework is not always the most well-working globally, and there have been other frameworks too, from Indian Kala to 64 arts, to the Japanese way to network arts through Zen or playfulness, to art walls, which emerged 1,000 years ago, as Akira Yamagasaki has shown us. As an esthetician, one works with frameworks which are hard to grab for others. Scholars all across the disciplines actually seek for help from aesthetic theory, and they often look for a way to rethink frameworks or attitudes, ways of approaching phenomena. Nick Young and Enrico Terrone studied the deeper logic of the building of the modern world in their essay, Aesthetics and Engineering, where they use Alan Carlson's concept of order appreciation, which was originally developed to explain how the aesthetic appreciation of nature functions. Through an appreciation of engineering, they claim that people appreciate the order present in machines, the natural principles behind it all, but also the natural laws behind the building processes and applications. So in the end, taking them close to the appreciation of nature itself. In their essay, A Neuroscience Perspective on Aesthetics, Rita Hari, who was a strong candidate for the Nobel Prize in Physics at some point, and Aina Puche write, I'm quoting, "As a part of evolution, aesthetic sensibility may have supported survival, reproductive success, decision-making, and social interaction." And that the close link between beauty and goodness remains evident in physical appearance that ranges from food freshness to reproductive fitness. However, aesthetic experiences are not limited to beauty or harmony, they say, and they quote many contemporary aestheticians. They lament the way human behavior has been studied either through only humanistic or only biological perspectives, and remind the reader about the problem that already Charles P. Snow wrote about in the early 20th century and discuss what they call neuroaesthetics, which they hope to combine the two, getting a helping hand from aesthetics. Interesting for us, these two natural scientists go back to Baumgarten, who they read, and discuss their results and studies and what happens when we watch paintings. For example, prediction errors between expected and received input. They discuss the way neuroimagining studies demonstrate that abstract art, which demands strong interpretive effort and thus greater beholder's share, enhance activation of higher level brain areas more than representational art. An aesthetician could of course ask, what do you mean with art and why do you want to discuss art? That could some of those phenomena you talk about actually touch more upon popular culture, which aims more than the art scene towards strong stimulation and aesthetic experience. Well, anyway, in the Companion Species Manifesto, her work on human and animal relationships, which has inspired many, Donna Haraway calls animals that labeled as companion species. And I feel that this sounds like a good roadmap to think about when we speak of companion disciplines too. They don't have to be that technical. We live with the dog and exchange knowledge, emotions, and warmth. Could one think of the role of aesthetics in other disciplines to be in the same way? It doesn't have to be a tool, the companion I mean, but an organic companion, like when philosophers sometimes talk about the friendship of philosophers. As a companion science, aesthetics might not be at the core of what natural science is, literature studies, art history, or curatorial studies are, but there is a constant exchange of ideas, perspectives, concepts, and other theoretical help offered by aesthetics. And aesthetics definitely is a bit of an underdog in all territories where its help is needed. But why would we need to lead the game? Is it not enough to enter the dialogue and to shed light on what we can do better? At least we could try out a bit more what the idea of being a companion discipline for others could mean and what it has meant during the relatively short history of our discipline. Implicitly, many of us working in other fields might already have a good idea of this. There is no need to fight in the fashion of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. It could be useful to take a more hermeneutic stance, to see where we come from, what we're capable of doing, and to learn in dialogue about what others are already doing in their own philosophically less developed aesthetics. It will not be for all of us, but For sure, many of us might have unexpected adventures waiting for us. I have here presented perspectives and taken from 3 books: Aesthetics in Dialogue 2020, Aesthetics Across the Disciplines 2023, and Accompanying Aesthetics, Philosophy of Art's Role in Other Disciplines, hopefully out in the end of this year, which I have edited with Zoltan Shomigi, and try to allure you into our passion of obsession. I'll try to distribute the ideas so that it will be easy to digest from whatever background one has in aesthetics, 1 or 2 foots in it, or only a half, and I'll leave it to you to think about, criticize, and of course apply or rethink. While I haven't maybe been able to here to present rigid answers or a new paradigm, I hope the small shift in thinking could offer one possible route to at least think about when we head towards the future. Thank you for listening to me.